Except because it's a house you own. And I think it's going to be April 1, and he just told me like last week. I was like, he said, I was going to Chicago. He said, one of us has a memory problem. Anyway, so he's really doing well. He's working really well and making a lot of money and loves the show. He's doing economic prediction for housing. The department chair of the business department of UWA said her husband called me and said, he said he got a master's in that. I said, so I think, what a full circle. I was bringing him to the campus to see the kids Sunday, and we take walks with our binoculars. And now he's teaching. I know.
If you would remember, say hi.
Oh, he will definitely.
Oh, that is really nice.
I'm very proud of him. And look at you on Jeremy is the snowball. So much but he's an artist and making money at Whole Foods.
I mean, I assume it's still the case, but I used to hear a few years ago from all the young people, they love it. But for them, it's really
Because he needs that space. I just visited and because of the and they do that when you pass but anyway, it's a fun. It's over here.
I've never seen this.
All right, if I could have everyone's attention, please. I told people I could talk without a microphone and everyone would hear me, so you know I'm not exaggerating now. Before we get started, and before I make my announcements, the League of Women Voters would like to make a couple announcements about some candidate forums coming up.
Correct. Hi, I know my voice does carry also. I just wanted to let everyone know that on Wednesday, this Wednesday, March 8th, we will have a candidate forum sponsored by us, but along with, and the people who are running it is the high school students of Lincoln High. They contacted me and I was able to give them our outline and I said, go with it, tweak it the way you want. So they have taken the reins and that is going to be held. The doors will open at 6:30 at Lincoln Hall, the auditorium, Lincoln Auditorium. There is access, easy access on the lakeside with limited parking for those who have problems with stairs. But it's also going to be on youtube.com at Manitowoc Lincoln High School 5093, and there's a question mark, but that's the website that you can go to so that you can watch it at home if, say, the weather is inclement, and you never know. And then for those of you who live in Two Rivers, we will have the candidate forum for council, for the Common Council. We have 3 incumbents and 3 other candidates who are running for Common Council. And that is also the doors will open at 6:30, but the forums will start at 7. After both sets of forums where the candidates give their little statement, the public will be allowed to ask questions. And that is also on youtube.com, Two Rivers. There's a space in between WI, and then it says stream. All right. So if those of you can't come out for that one, at least you've got the website.
Where is it?
Oh, thank you. That's at City Hall on the 3rd floor. That's where it's going to be held. And then walk-in voting is also going to happen on March 21st. And the reason for all these forums now is because by next week, Tuesday, the absentee ballots are going to be sent out. This way you have the information to make a good choice. Okay, thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I will now use the microphone just so that I'm not yelling. Before we get started, as always, I would like to thank our series sponsors, without whom we would not be able to do this 8-week series. So, as always, a huge thank you to the League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, the Manitowoc Public Library Foundation, the Manitowoc Public Library, the Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, and Lakeshore Pax Christi. So please, a huge round of applause for our series sponsors. Next, and just a couple quick things, and then I'll get the speaker up here, who I'm sure you would like to hear talk more than me, since you get to hear me talk all too frequently. I heard a cell phone go off. Please remember to silence your cell phone. So thank you to whoever got that call, because that reminded me. I might not have said it otherwise. When it comes to the Q&A session following this evening, remember that Linda, who is in the back of the room and brewed our wonderful coffee this evening, will be running around with a microphone to everyone in the room. So please give her time to get to your questions. I'll be handling the people who are asking questions online. So then just a few other library and city related announcements. I announced this last week, but I thought I'd do it one more time while the registration period is still open. Since Japan has opened its border to tourism again, the Sister City Student Exchange Program has started up again. So if you know anyone who is currently in high school in the Manitowoc area and would be interested in the Kamigawa Student Exchange, let them know that these pamphlets are available and they can find out all the information with the pamphlet and the URL that's given within the pamphlet. You can get these at the library, at City Hall, and at the tourism office across the street on A Street. So another program I thought you might be interested in that is starting this week is the Manitowoc Public Library is offering a seed library starting on this Saturday for anyone interested in gardening. You can check up to 4 packets of seeds every time you visit the library. It's completely free. It's going to be a card catalog that the Manitowoc County Historical Society has donated to us. It's going to be on the first floor. So anytime you come to the library, if you're interested in gardening, check out the seed library and check out the seeds and take some home and start gardening. Also this Saturday from 9 a.m. till noon, we're having the 3rd annual Lakeshore Area Seed Exchange. We'll be doing that with the Lakeshore Seed Collective. And essentially, the way they describe it, it's like a potluck, except with seeds. So you can come and get seeds. If you have extra seeds, bring them to swap with people. Tell your gardening stories. If you don't have seeds, you can still come and get seeds for what you want to plant in your garden. It's a great time, and it happens this Saturday from 9 a.m. till noon. And now, exactly. David P. Fields is the Associate Director of the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is the author of Foreign Friends, Syngman Rhee, American Exceptionalism, and the Division of Korea, University Press of Kentucky, 2019. He is the editor of The Diary of Syngman Rhee, published by the Museum of Contemporary Korean History, and the book review editor of the Journal of American East Asian Relations. He has been published in the Washington Post, the National Interest, North Korea Review, Journal of American East Asian Relations, SinoNK.com, Transactions of the Royal Asiatic Society Korea Branch, and in the working paper series of the Cold War International History Project. His commentary and analysis has appeared on National Public Radio, Wisconsin Public Radio, C-SPAN, and CNN, among others. He earned his PhD in history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2017, and from 2016 to 2017, he was a Fulbright Scholar at Yonsei University in Seoul, South Korea. So, exactly. And take a look at how young he is. Very impressive. I had the privilege of working with him one other time online when we were in the midst of COVID. And it's a pleasure to welcome David Fields to our library this evening. Professor Fields.
Thank you very much, Tim, for that introduction, and thank you for all of the sponsors of this series. It's such a great series, and I'm so honored to be here because at the University of Wisconsin, we believe in this thing that we call the Wisconsin idea, and that's the idea. Yes, that's all about. That's the idea that we're all better when the state and the community and ideally policymakers come together to discuss things that are really important to all of us, all right? But the thing about the Wisconsin idea is it works the best in this kind of forum, right? And that's why I love getting this invitation. Otherwise, we at the university just talk to ourselves. And that's not good. That's not good. We need to get out in public. And it's forums like this that allow us to do that. So thank you very much for the invitation tonight. As Tim said, in going over that bio, you'll see that a lot of my expertise is really in Korea. And that's what I was here to speak to you about last time was modern Korean politics. I've lived in the ROK for about 4 years. I've studied Korean for 10 years. I'm more comfortable with the title expert when I'm talking about Korea, okay? When I'm talking about China, I'm coming to you basically from my perspective as a historian and also my perspective of teaching the history of U.S. East Asian relations at the University of Wisconsin for the last half decade, okay? I'm less comfortable with the term expert. I would feel more comfortable saying just well-read, okay? Well-read on this topic. I've spent about 10 weeks in China. I don't speak Chinese. I don't have that same sort of familiarity as I do when I'm talking about Korea. But I think the great thing about being a historian is everyone's a foreigner to history, right? History is a foreign land that historians just spend a lot of time sojourning in. So I've spent significant time sojourning in the history of U.S. East Asian relations. And it's based on what I've learned from doing that I'll be talking to you today. And since I am a historian, I'm going to root what I'm going to say to you today in the past, although we will get up to the present for sure. We're going to have a discussion of the origins of the Pacific War, what caused US and Japan to go to war in the 1940s, and what are the similarities and the differences between what's happening today. Like most professional historians, I don't believe that history repeats itself, but it often rhymes. Okay, it often rhymes. It's never the same thing over again, but it's often similar. So what about that situation is rhyming with some of the things that's happening today? And as a disclaimer, I will say that what I'm going to do tonight, I usually do in 45 hours in my course at the University of Wisconsin. So I'm gonna move really, really quickly. But I hope we can engage in a Q&A afterwards, and I'm happy to discuss the questions you have. I probably won't have the answers, okay, but hopefully the discussion will be instructive in and of itself. So I'm going to structure my talk today really around two key points. What were the stepping stones to conflict between the U.S. and Japan, okay? What caused a relationship that was more or less functional in the first half of the 20th century to spawn one of the bloodiest wars of the 20th century? And then what are the stepping stones to tension with China? We are not in a conflict with China right now. I personally hope we never will be in a conflict with China right now. But what are the stepping stones to the current tensions that we're experiencing? And then what are the implications for U.S. foreign policy and for citizens like you? Okay, and that's one of the great things about the Foreign Policy Association and the Great Decisions series is we get together and we talk about these things. And I love hearing about the Sister City project with Japan because I feel like it highlights that we're all connected. I think there's a lot of people who like to imagine the entire Midwest as flyover country, okay? And that's not true. There's deep connections here. There's deep connections in Wisconsin between the rest of the world and East Asia. And as a proud Wisconsinite, I never tire of pointing that out. So what were the stepping stones to conflict with Japan? And what are the stepping stones to tension with China? All right, I'll cover 4 in this first part. Japan's desire to be the leading power in East Asia. U.S. support turning to ideological opposition, the Japanese belief in U.S. racist motives, and U.S. choices that incentivized Japanese adventurism. And I'll go through each of these. Okay, first, Japan's desire to be the leading power of East Asia. Japan believed in the late 19th and early 20th century that it needed the resources, especially of Northeast Asia, this area right here, of Manchuria, if it was going to survive and thrive as a nation. Japan at this point has about 1/3 of the population of the United States and 26 times less of national area. Okay, so a very large population on some very small islands. And for reasons that some of them were well-founded, some were ill-founded, the Japanese political leadership believed that it needed these resources of Northeast Asia if it was going to thrive and reach its national potential. Japan also had a different experience with the West, and especially China and Korea had, where its response to modernization was to make fundamental reforms very, very quickly. And as such, Japan felt that they had mastered the technology of modernization and that they could serve as a model to other East Asian states as to how they could modernize. And so Japan really sought to be the leader of Northeast Asia because it needed the resources and it believed it had valuable experience that it could share with other countries in the region. Now, at first, the United States was actually willing to accept Japan's rise as a regional power, all right, especially under President Teddy Roosevelt, who believed that Japan was more civilized than the Russian Empire, which was really quite a shocking view at the time, that a non-white power would be more civilized than a white power, but that's how TR felt. He felt that actually Japan's control of Northeast Asia would stabilize the region, and it would be preferable to Russian control. So the United States does not oppose Japan's colonization of Korea in 1905. It does not oppose Japan taking over German possessions in the Shantung Peninsula in China in 1919. It protests the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, but really doesn't take action to stop it, okay? But after Japan's invasion of the rest of China, moving south into the Chinese mainland in 1931, the United States comes to oppose the Japanese empire primarily for ideological reasons, okay? Primarily for ideological reasons because it was so violent, okay? And this was one of the touchstone images of 1931, the Bloody Saturday photograph, okay, that resulted from the Japanese bombing of a train station in Shanghai, which was shown in newsreels, in theaters all across the United States and all across the world. It really highlighted the violence of what the Japanese empire was doing. It was also very undemocratic, okay? Japan had many of the formal trappings of democracy, but as their empire expanded, the real core of the Japanese empire was exposed. And then it was also contrary to what many American policymakers believed was the prevailing direction of historical development, okay, which was away from empires. Imperialism was on the wane and the rise of nationalism, okay, that nations should be self-defined and self-governing units, all right? So they felt that what Japan was doing in East Asia was violent, it was undemocratic, and it was against the flow of political development, all right? American opposition to the Japanese empire was more ideological than economic, all right? It's very important that we understand this. It would have been much, much more profitable for the United States to continue supporting the Japanese empire, to continue selling oil and scrap metal and aviation technology to the Japanese empire through the 1930s. But once the United States started condemning what the Japanese were doing on moral grounds, all right, it placed its own ideological interests ahead of its economic ones, okay? Very important that we understand this was an ideological decision. Now, how the Japanese received this was a little bit different. They interpreted the United States' response to their empire not necessarily as ideological, but rather as racial in nature, okay? Because after all, the Japanese never tired of pointing this out, the United States did not oppose the creation of European empires, okay? The United States accepted naval parity with Great Britain, which they would never do with Japan, okay? Insisted that the Japanese Navy had to stay smaller than the American Navy. And the Japanese came to believe that the US was determined to keep Japan down at any cost. And this was especially angering to the Japanese, who believed that they were just doing in East Asia what the United States had done in Latin America, all right? And the Japanese would call their policy in Northeast Asia the Asian Monroe Doctrine, okay? That is how they explained what they were doing. They were saying, we need to stabilize our near abroad, okay? We need to develop this region. We need to eliminate foreign threats to our security in this region, just as you have done in Latin America, all right? And they get more and more frustrated with the United States as it gets more and more active in condemning what the Japanese are doing, because they believe that the United States is denying Japan the opportunity to do what the United States has done in its region, all right? There are problems with that interpretation, for sure. But this is how the Japanese see what they're doing. They also, along with the anger, becomes a kind of sense of self-righteousness, and that the Japanese believe that they had a morally superior culture to the United States. And they were not ashamed to say so. And they would say so before the conflict, and they would say so after the conflict. So let me just quote one, Lieutenant Commander Chihaya Masutaka, who said, quote, "We thought that we could easily tackle the Americans, a race so steeped in material comfort and absorbed in the pursuit of pleasure had to be spiritually degenerate." Okay, they believed that their spiritual superiority to the United States meant that they could achieve a victory. And it made it especially galling when the United States was condemning what they were doing. Okay, so we looked at Japan's desire to be the leading country, the United States' support turning to ideological opposition, the Japanese belief in the racist motivations of the United States, and then finally the US made strategic choices that incentivized Japanese adventurism in East Asia. By the late 1930s, the US had come to oppose Japanese expansion in East Asia with words, but too little action. All right. And part of the reason for this is because American policymakers thought the Japanese understood that the absolutely massive economic advantage and production advantage that the United States had over Japan made a war with the United States suicidal. Okay. They thought Japanese leadership understood this. It did not understand this. Okay. Especially when the Japanese began a crash naval armament program in 1936, and the United States does almost nothing to respond. So you can see in this chart how Japanese defense expenditures take off and American defense expenditures for 3 years do very, very little. The United States does not match their armament spending, okay? The US is still dealing with the effects of the Great Depression and does not want to put any more resources than necessary in battleships, thinking that the Japanese already know that we can catch up when we want to, okay? But we don't. And this gave the Japanese Navy, the Imperial Japanese Navy, actually an advantage, a naval advantage in the Pacific theater over the United States in the early 1940s, all right? And just as Japan is gaining this temporary naval advantage in the region, the US begins to attack the Japanese economy over its actions in China. And this is not led by the United States government. It's actually led by citizens, okay? Citizens just like you, just like me, who look at images like the Bloody Saturday photograph and what Japan is doing in China and start boycotting Japanese products, okay? Especially silk, all right? And other exports from Japan to the United States. And here is a chart that was from a pamphlet that was printed in Boston in 1938 entitled, "Did Your Stockings Kill Babies?" Okay, probably sounds familiar of other types of protests, all right? What begins though as a moral embargo turns into an official embargo, okay? Especially as Japan starts going into Southeast Asia. The United States begins to officially embargo scrap metal, aviation technology, and finally, fuel oil, all right? And the Japanese see this as further evidence that the United States is determined to keep them down at any cost whatsoever, is determined to enforce this double standard on Japan, all right? And this is the story behind the attack of Pearl Harbor. Japan in 1941 knows it has a temporary naval advantage over the United States in the Pacific. In 1940, you can see American expenditures are starting to take off. They know that this window is going to close. The Americans are strangling their economy, and they decide to attack. And I think you all know what happens next. Okay, I think you know what happens next. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers are killed. All right, millions of civilians die. And the United States outproduces Japan, okay, and defeats Japan utterly in the war. It takes time, but Japan was no match for the United States economically, all right? They hoped that they could eliminate the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, and the morally and spiritually bankrupt Americans would essentially give up, and that Japan could consolidate its position in East Asia in the meantime. And that is not what happened, okay? But what did happen was so costly and so tragic. I think it's worthwhile asking, could this have been avoided? Okay. Was there some way that the Japanese could have been convinced that it was their behavior in China that was the problem? Okay. It was not racism. Okay. That it was not the United States was determined to keep them down at any cost. The United States would accept Japan as the wealthy leading power in East Asia. Okay. As we did in the 1980s and 90s and 2000s. That was possible. Okay, could that have messaging been different? all right? Could a more open economic system have provided the Japanese with the resources they needed without resorting to this kind of conflict? Would a more timely armament program have prevented the kind of Japanese adventurism that led to war? All right, these are all counterfactuals. We can't know these for sure, but the costs of the war are so staggeringly tremendous that I think it's important to ask ourselves these questions and to think about these questions as we're looking at the US relationship with the PRC today. And that's the second half of what I want to talk to you about. The stepping stones to tension with China. And there are three of them, and they're somewhat similar. Not the same, but maybe you could say they rhyme. All right. There is China's desire for restored status. US support for this turns to ideological opposition. And the Chinese believing the US is trying to keep them down, okay, at all costs. And I'll go through each of these just as I did in the case with Japan. China's desire for restored status. I think to understand the current state of affairs, the current mentality that prevails within the PRC, we have to cover briefly some Chinese history, such as, say, the last 2 millennia of Chinese history. The important thing to understand is this is from the year 1 AD to the present. Different civilizations or countries, it's kind of a double standard here, and their percentage of world GDP. And what you will see is from 1 AD to about 1850, either India or China is the richest society in the world, okay? It's a rich society. It's an incredible, powerful society. It's one of the most advanced societies on earth, which is one of the reasons China has such a massive population today. But about 300 years ago, that began to change. And by the 1850s, the European powers and Japan were in a position to dictate terms to China. And from 1840 to 1949, China would go through what the PRC today calls China's century of humiliation, okay? Where foreign powers forced China to participate in the global economy and in international relations on Western terms, okay? Not on Chinese terms. They defeated the Chinese armed forces and Navy wherever they found them. They took chunks of Chinese territory, and throughout the 1930s, Japan would almost conquer China, okay? Not completely, but it would almost conquer China, all while China's internal politics is in chaos, starting with the Taiping Rebellion, going through the Boxer Rebellion, and then through the very long Civil War from 1911, which really World War II interrupts, and then concluding in 1949. So the Chinese Communist Party comes to power in 1949, vowing to put an end to all this, to put China back on its feet again. They wanted to restore some sense of stability in China. Okay, they wanted to restore China's status. And initially, because of ideological tensions over communism and China's decision to intervene in the Korean War, the US and China have no relations whatsoever. Okay, very soon after 1949, all right? But that would change in 1972 when Richard Nixon reestablishes relations with the PRC. And this is one of the great diplomatic coups of the Cold War, that Nixon is able to do this, all right? And this relationship is really based on 4 principles, okay? Number 1, normalization would create a balance of power between China, the USSR, and the United States. It was a signal that the US was no longer interested in rolling back communism everywhere, and it was also a signal that the USSR could no longer count on Chinese support to promote its interest, okay? This really freed up China to be able to focus on its own development. Instead of a bipolar world, we had a tripolar world, right? And a 3-legged stool is much more stable than a 2-legged stool, okay? This is one of the principles. Number 2, the number 2 principle was that China would not become a serious rival of the United States for a long time, if ever. And this is actually put in the Shanghai Communiques. And it's not the United States that puts it there, it's the Chinese who put it there, okay? And they say, quote, China will never be a superpower and it opposes hegemony and power politics of any kind. Okay, this is the second principle of normalization. The third principle, neither the US or China will seek hegemony in East Asia. The US would not seek new agreements in East Asia to contain China, and China would not object to the relationships that the United States already had with Korea and Japan, and China would not seek to control its neighbors. And then the fourth principle, and in many ways to the PRC, I think this was the most important principle, and that's the United States would not try to fundamentally change China, okay? This is so important that we understand this. It's also important that we understand that Mao Zedong had killed more Chinese than any white imperialist ever had, okay? What Xi Jinping has done in Hong Kong and Xinjiang, which is absolutely terrible, is nothing compared to Mao's destruction of human life. Tens of millions of Chinese starved to death during the Great Leap Forward. Tens of thousands are rounded up and killed during his purges, during Mao's purges, and during the Cultural Revolution. And Nixon does not bring this up at all. He does not talk about it, okay? Democracy was not a priority for him. Now, he hoped that China would evolve naturally over time, and that this opening would be a part of that development, all right? But Nixon pledged that the United States was not trying to fundamentally change China. And to China's leadership, this was very important, okay? Because they were delighted by this new relationship on these terms. They felt respected, and they felt that their security had been provided for, and they could pursue their own kind of development at home, okay? They believed that they had come to an amicable understanding with the United States, and that the United States maybe wouldn't be a partner, but it at least was not gonna stand in the way of China's development, all right? However, and this system works very well for quite some time, but these four principles over our lifetime, we've watched them break down. All right, we've watched them break down. Let's just go back through them. Creating a balance of power between the USSR, China, and the United States. All right, this is really no longer necessary after the end of the Cold War, right? The first principle is no longer operable. There is no Soviet Union any longer. The second one, China's entry to the World Trade Organization, which was supported by the United States in 2001, sets off explosive growth in China. Okay, and China grows so rapidly that it seems to have the potential to catch the United States in just a matter of decades, much quicker than even the Chinese themselves thought. Okay, now I want to be very clear about something. The Chinese economy is nearly the same size as the United States in terms of nominal GDP. Nominal GDP. All right, but that is not an actual measure of the wealth of Chinese society that it creates. All right, I think GDP per PPP, or GDP per capita, okay, is a much more compelling number, because remember how many more Chinese there are than American. And when you look at China's economy in terms of GDP per capita, it is poorer than Mexico. Okay, it is poorer than Mexico. We need to keep that in mind. The Chinese economy has grown tremendously. They are nowhere near the United States in terms of GDP per capita, and in terms of the wealth that they can actually create for its citizens, okay? But China has grown and is clearly a major economic power and regional power, all right? So we've looked at number one, number two. Number three, China has become much more assertive in the recent years in its near abroad, okay? In the region, it has been constructing, although it hasn't for some time, artificial islands in the South China Seas, okay? It's been bullying its neighbors, the ROK, over the deployment of THAAD missile batteries or not, or the THAAD missile batteries. Now, whether or not China is seeking hegemony in the region, I think is still an open question, but certainly it wants as much influence in the region as it can get at a reasonable cost, okay? It is clearly seeking to expand its influence in the region and around the globe. You've probably heard of the Belt and Road Initiative, okay? And China's investments in infrastructure all over the globe, right? I think the danger of this is actually much overblown, and I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A if you want. But there's no doubt that China is investing abroad, and it's using its economic weight abroad, all right? And then the fourth point, American policymakers seem to be more determined than ever to fundamentally change China, okay? And now many would say that this was always the goal, okay? This was why Nixon did this, right? He wanted China to change. And that was partially true. That was partially true. But Nixon expected this change to come slowly as China developed economically, all right? And China has changed. It's unrecognizable from 1972. In 1972, China looked like North Korea, okay? Today, it does not. The economic development is unbelievable, right? But its politics are still undeniably authoritarian, and it has not enshrined individual rights. But China has changed, and in many ways is much more open and liberal than it was in 1972. But it hasn't changed in the way that American policymakers were hoping. And this has caused many Americans to believe that the opening to China in 1972 was a mistake, all right? And currently, many of our political leaders are calling for a new paradigm where we view the world in terms of democracies versus authoritarianism, all right? And Mike Pompeo, perhaps more than anyone else, went farther and warned if the United States did not change China, China would change us. And we see more and more of this rhetoric in Washington and to Beijing. This is a fundamental reversal of the fourth principle, okay, that has undergirded U.S.-China relations from 1972. And it allows Beijing, with a straight face, to argue that it's not China that's changed, that they've always been the way they are, that it's actually the United States that has changed, right? And there is something to that, for sure. The breakdown of these principles feeds a Chinese belief that the U.S. is trying to keep China down, and that the U.S. is opposed to China's rise on principle. And let me just go through a few examples for you. The ongoing trade war with China started under President Donald Trump, all right? It is not that China's trade practices have been flawless. They have been far from flawless, okay? They have been very bad, in fact, all right? But rather than addressing China's trade practices through the WTO or another international body, the United States has continuously undermined the WTO. It was Barack Obama who first refused to reappoint judges to the WTO for its dispute settlement body. And Donald Trump has continued that. And Joe Biden has not appointed any new. So right now, the only dispute settling body in the WTO is unable to function because they do not have a single judge that is appointed, okay? So rather than going through the proper channels for this, the United States, under Donald Trump, first we undermined the WTO, and then we engaged in a trade war with China, a bilateral trade war with China, not with our allies, not with the other people who are also suffering from Chinese trade practices, but alone, okay? And this really undermined the moral standing of our argument. And it allows the Chinese to tell their own people, it's not what we're doing, okay? It's the fact that you want to keep China down at any cost whatsoever, all right? Another example. And this is human rights, all right? The Chinese leadership does not believe that the American commitment to democracy is genuine at all, but is being used as a weapon to destabilize China, all right? And the Uyghur situation is a case in point. And I want to be absolutely clear that what is happening to the Uyghur people is terrible, and it is awful, and it is heartbreaking to read about. But in many ways, it is very similar to what China has done to Tibetans, okay, for the last 50 years. It's different in that it uses new types of technology, which we find unsettling, and it's different in that the numbers are larger, okay, because the population of Uyghurs is larger than Tibetans. But in many ways, it's the same kind of thing China has engaged in, really since the founding of the PRC. And the United States had an approach to deal with this issue, okay, of Tibetan human rights. The Chinese leadership was never unclear where the United States stood on Tibet, okay? It was never unclear. We always welcomed the Dalai Lama. We always spoke out in favor of Tibetan human rights, but American policymakers believed that this issue should not be elevated to the place where it would torpedo the rest of the relationship, because after all, what power do we have to change their behavior towards Tibetans, right? What power do we have to change their behavior towards Uyghurs? And it's awful suspicious to the Chinese that our stance on Uyghurs changes after we begin a unilateral trade war with China. And it undermines the morality of the argument that we're trying to make, and allows the Chinese to dismiss this as mere rhetoric in the service of keeping China down. This is how they receive this action. Many Chinese believe the US will never accept China as a major world power, and that the United States is attempting to thwart China's rise and is using its ideological commitments to democracy and human rights to do so, okay? And further, they argue that all of this is contrary to the basic principles that allowed the US-China relationship to function in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, all right? The Chinese leadership believes that the United States is weaponizing its economic might in order to constrain Chinese power, just as China is coming near to parity with the United States, all right? And the Chinese who believe this can see ample evidence of this kind of ideology coming out of Washington, all right? Now, there are very key differences between the US-Japan relationship in the 1930s and the US-China relationship today, but I think some of the parallels are hard to miss, and some of the rhyming is hard to miss, okay? Now, the question is, what do we do about it? What should we do about this, all right? And I have a few takeaways that I think we can learn from this. A few ways to how these tensions can be managed and perhaps conflict can be avoided. And the very first one I think we need to recognize is that China is not an existential threat to the United States. All right, I completely disagree with Representative Krishnamurti, all right, and his testimony before the Select Committee on China this past Tuesday last week. All right, China is not an existential threat to the United States. And we don't need a China policy as badly as we need an America policy, all right? And I'm not referring here to protectionism. I'm not referring to economic nationalism. I'm not referring to Smoot-Hawley style tariffs, all right? What I'm referring to is investments in basic infrastructure, in education, in research and development that will allow the United States to keep its edge, all right? If we are worried about China dominating the future of AI technologies, then we should be educating the next generation of AI developers here in the United States, all right? If we are worried about Chinese hardware containing backdoors, then we need to be investing in the kind of technology that can detect backdoors, because if you have that technology, you have nothing to worry about. If you don't have that technology, it doesn't matter whether your 5G equipment is made in China, or whether it's made in Korea, or whether it's made in Finland, or whether it's made right here in America. If you can't detect that, you are vulnerable. And you should all look up the history of this wonderful firm called Crypto AG, a Swiss firm that handled secure communications for over 60 countries and banks and militaries in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, who everybody knew that they could trust because it was Swiss. And that's where you put your money. The Swiss are discreet. And in 2018, it was revealed that Crypto AG was wholly owned by the CIA and German intelligence. And we were reading other people's secure information, and we were getting paid to do it, all right? It was a brilliant strategy, all right? But the lesson is national origins is never a good test for the security of any product. Either you can verify the security of it yourself, or you cannot. If you can, you have little to worry about. If you can't, you have everything to worry about, whether it comes from China or whether it doesn't, all right? And I could say the same thing about WeChat and TikTok, okay, but I'll stop there. I'm absolutely against these bans, all right? I think it sends the absolute wrong message. And it's not that there are not issues with these platforms. There are absolutely issues with these platforms and the way they handle data and the way their algorithms serve up information. But the same problems exist with Twitter and exist with Facebook, all right? And removing and banning TikTok from the United States does not solve that other problem. There's not a single data protection law for all of the United States. And as many analysts have pointed out, if the Chinese want access to Americans' personal data, they can go out right now and buy it from third-party vendors, okay? They do not need their own apps to do that. We could do much, much more in this regard to protect our citizens, to protect their data, to protect our politics from the pernicious effects of some of these algorithms. And banning TikTok is not going to do it. It needs to be a much broader discussion. We need to embrace an ethos of innovation and competition and investment that has made the United States such a dynamic society. We need to focus more on our own development than on threats from China. And I think we need to believe in our own principles of openness and competition, right? I think that is how we win. China is not an existential threat to us. We are the only existential threat to us. We have been blessed with free security, basically. Our nearest adversary over an ocean away. All right, we need to have confidence and think clearly about this. Second, we need to utilize a strategy that maximizes our strengths. All right, at the end of my 45 hours of lecture, I still can't believe the students will listen to me for that long. 45 hours over 15 weeks. I ask my students, what makes the United States a superpower, right? Because where we start our course in 1898, the United States is not a superpower. It's barely a regional power, all right? What makes the United States a superpower? It's not our economy, and it's not our military. It's neither one of those things. Those things are impressive, okay? But it's our allies. It's our allies around the world, and it's these alliances that are not just built on military cooperation, they're built on a shared vision of the world and how human society should operate. And this is the reason that why our relationship with South Korea, with Japan, with NATO, our most recently reinvigorated relationship with the Philippines, all of these alliances have outlasted the original circumstances in which they were created. They're all Cold War alliances. How long did the Warsaw Pact last after the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? Not a day. These alliances have lasted because they're about a shared vision of the world, okay? They're about a shared vision of the world. And without these alliances, the United States would just be the world's most impressive regional power, all right? Without these alliances, we would just be a very impressive regional power. It's these alliances that really makes the United States a superpower. And China does not have that, okay? They have a few very transactional relationships with Russia and with North Korea. They have nothing that can match that. And we need a strategy that maximizes the strength of ours that the Chinese do not have. And the good news is, there is such a strategy in place, okay? And the terrible news is, we abandoned that strategy and we haven't gone back to it, okay? And I'm talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, all right? In the mid-2000s, many American policymakers saw China rising, okay? And they understood that the Chinese economy in many ways poses challenges to World Trade Organization rules. All right, the WTO was not designed to manage a state that has so much state ownership of industry, all right? They knew that China was also not a responsible player when it came to intellectual property and joint ventures. And they crafted a new set of trade and investment rules, actually at the suggestion of the Japanese and of countries in the region, that said WTO does not fit this situation well. Let's come up with something better, all right? And let's come up with a new market of all the countries of the Pacific Rim, okay? Let's create a new type of trade deal that will maximize all of our strength, that will lower barriers of trade between our countries, and will be a huge carrot to China that they will have to raise their standards if they ever want to be a part of this. It was a brilliant and far-seeing policy. And in 2016, both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton campaigned against it. An utter lack of moral courage. Absolutely disheartening. Both of them campaigned against it. Very disheartening, okay? And of course, on his first day in office, Donald Trump left the deal that all the countries in the region acknowledged was so valuable, and instead decided to carry on a unilateral trade war, not just with China, but also with our allies, South Korea and Japan, okay? It was a huge blunder, probably the greatest blunder of American foreign policy in the last 20 years, all right? At least in East Asia. And President Biden came to office pledging to restore credibility to American alliances. And he has had some success. He has had some success in doing that, right? But he has not revived the TTP. And it's so disheartening that when this was discussed at the Select Committee on China meeting last week, that it was acknowledged by everyone that there was no political appetite in the Congress to do so because they don't think the American people support it. It's a very, very sad state of affairs. It was a brilliant strategy. It can still be revived. We should still do it because it's a strategy that maximizes the United States' advantages in this region, addresses China's unacceptable behavior in the least threatening way possible. In the least threatening way possible. Instead of all sticks, it was a giant carrot that in the rest, that would make the rest of the states and the communities richer to boot, okay? We need to find policies that will address China's behavior in the least threatening way possible, all right? And there's much we could do. There's much we could do. In many ways, we can just roll back some of the disastrous policies of the last 6 or 7 years, such as ending the counterproductive trade war with China, which, by the way, was not cheap and is not easy to win. It's still not over. It has not accomplished any of its stated goals. It's contrary to decades of American opinion and rhetoric in support of free trade, and yet we're not doing it because there is not a single congressman who wants to be labeled as being soft on China, even though this policy makes no sense at all right? On silicone chips, okay, we should be taking steps to make sure that we can produce silicone chips here in the United States. I think that is a wise thing to do. And I think it's good to invest in that, although it's a slippery slope. And we have to make sure that it doesn't cross the line into industrial policy. It's a very slippery slope, but I think it's a wise thing to do. Excluding China from global supply chains in the production of silicon chips, I think is a mistake. There's not a single analyst out there who believes that the Chinese will never develop this technology on their own. The most optimistic forecast is that it will take China 10 years to develop UV chip technology, right? The cutting edge. And that's only if they reverse engineer ours. And that assumes that they don't find another way of doing it themselves. Sooner or later, China will get this technology. They will master this technology. They will produce these chips. And there'll be an ocean of ill will between China and the United States over this. Our previous policy was keep the Chinese 2 generations behind in chips, all right? And that policy was actually working. And the Chinese were not resisting it that much. That's done for now. That's done for now. It's all out competition in this field. And furthermore, a lot of our policies are forcing our allies in the region to choose between participating in American supply chains or participating in Chinese supply chains. And that is not a choice that they want to make, right? Fortunately for us, the Chinese behavior in the region has been so bad. It's been so bad that there's a lot of sympathy towards the United States, but that's not what they want. That is not what they want. Diplomatically, we need to avoid highly symbolic actions that inflame tensions with China and do nothing to further American interest in the region. I'm talking about Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan last August. All right, and now Kevin McCarthy has vowed he's going to do the same thing. Absolute folly. Absolute folly. It does nothing for the security of Taiwan. It does nothing for the security of the United States, and it drives the Chinese insane. We should be selling Taiwan barbed wire. We should be selling Taiwan barbed wire. And the Chinese don't get upset when we do that. That is what we should be doing. And instead, we're engaging in political theater that is raising the stakes over and over again. We need to prioritize substance over style in our interactions with China. And we need to make sure that our politicians know that we want a smart policy towards China, not a policy that's afraid to look weak. And I'm worried right now that's what we're getting. Militarily, we need to stick to Theodore Roosevelt's advice of walk softly, but carry a big stick. All right. And I think in this regard, we're not making the same sort of mistake that we made in the 1930s. All right. Our military is remaining on par when it comes to projecting power in the region. All right. But we need to ensure that we are supplying our allies, including Taiwan, with the type of material that they need. Okay. That they need to become indigestible. Not high-end weapon systems like fourth-generation fighters, all right? We also need to be wary of threat inflation when it comes to China, all right? We need to make sure that our goal is not ensuring that we can defeat China and East Asia at any cost whatsoever, because that absolutely terrifies our allies, because they know who will pay the cost of that. Our goal needs to be maintaining the status quo as long as possible, ensuring that we have enough force in the region to deter China from attacking. That should be our primary goal. To conclude, I called this talk today, Preventing Another Pearl Harbor. All right, but actually, if we're gonna be honest, and I think most historians who say this will tell you this, there is no way that we can 100% guarantee that there will not be another Pearl Harbor, all right? Most historians agree that the United States, that Japan attacking the United States was absolute folly, and yet it was done anyway, right? There's no 100% solution to avoid this, but I think we can do a lot better than we're doing right now at addressing Chinese behaviors in ways that are targeted to lower Chinese anxieties, not raise them as high as possible. There's a real possibility of conflict between the United States and China in the coming decades. It's a real possibility, and we need to recognize right now that the choices we make as Americans today will have an influence. And what we tell our politicians will have an influence. We need to educate ourselves on these issues and demand that our leaders pursue well thought out policies that make the chances of conflict less likely rather than more likely. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
I have absolutely no doubt that there are many questions. So please remember, before you start to double up on your questions, let everyone get their first question out. And secondly, I guarantee you that the microphone that Linda is carrying with her works. Do not be afraid of the microphone. Hold it close to your mouth and speak directly to it. And I see one hand up, so let's get started.
Oh, hi. When you were saying about China going all around the world and going to different places, now they're down in Panama. Now, to me, that's a very vital shipping corridor and everything else, but they're putting all this stuff in there to start this. Do you think that might be because they're trying to block up in the future, if it ever works out, block up the Panama Canal for shipping, such as military or anything like that?
So I'm not familiar with that in particular. I am familiar with BRI projects in South Asia and Africa and a few in Latin America. I'm not familiar with that one. But I would say if China was trying to do that, they will be operating in a very, very unfavorable environment, 7,000 miles away from China, where we'll be operating very close to our environment. And everything that I read about the composition of the Chinese Navy as it currently stands is focused on area deniability. right? It's gauged towards dominating the South China Seas. China is not interested in investing in naval capacity that can go toe-to-toe with the United States outside of its home region. They're not investing in that kind of thing. So I would be surprised if they want to do that, and if they do, I would be very surprised that it would be very successful. But I'm a historian. I'm not a naval analyst.
Thank you.
Got most recent news, I've heard the Chinese military is telling their troops to prepare for an invasion of Taiwan by 2025, 26.
Yeah, you see these reports quite often. And I would be shocked if the Chinese do not have a plan to invade Taiwan in 2026. I would be shocked if they don't have a plan to invade Taiwan in 2024. Just like I'm sure we have a plan to invade Canada next year. I don't think we're going to do it. Okay, but this is what military people do. They plan, and I think they're planning for this right now. But the question is, will they actually do it? And you may know, earlier this year in January, the Center for Strategic and International Studies did an open source war game, which was so incredibly valuable, because we know war games happen all the time and news leaks out. And the news leaking out of the Pentagon is the United States loses when Taiwan is invaded by China. Okay. But what you have to understand about those war games is they're not designed for the United States to win. These war games are designed for the United States to lose. You don't plan out war games that you know you're going to win. You plan them out so you're going to lose, so you can learn from it. So what CSI did is they did a war game, an open source war game, so it could all be done out in the public, and they simulated a Chinese invasion of Taiwan 24 times under many different kinds of circumstances, okay, with experts. And what they found out was that China loses every single time, okay? But it's catastrophic. It's catastrophic for all states involved. We don't want to go there. But they did this in order to make sure that we're fighting the tendency of threat perception, of threat inflation, rather, from China. It is unclear right now whether China could prevail. In fact, it seems like, and they gamed this out in 2026, okay, so in the very near term. And the Chinese lost every single time in an incredibly costly conflict. But I would also recommend to you a wonderful article written by John Culver, who's a former director of national intelligence in the United States, a 20-year career, actually 20-year, probably 40-year career in the CIA, who's written a wonderful article of what it would look like if China was preparing to go to war with Taiwan. All right, and it would be something that would be so massive, it is not a Pearl Harbor type situation. All right, it would be something that could be seen, that American intelligence would see. And we would know that at least they were making those sort of preparations. I don't think the Chinese have a tight timeline on Taiwan. I think they believe, as they've always believed, that time is on their side. The United States is 6,000 miles away, and sooner or later, Taiwan and China will be reunified. I'm not sure that they feel that they need to rush this decision. I could be wrong.
Before we get to another question in the room, I had one from someone online. And this actually goes back to Pearl Harbor. After Pearl Harbor, Japanese invasion of the Western USA was a great concern. Did they ever invade any of our coastal areas?
They did not. The closest they got was some of the Aleutians in Alaska. No, it was never. I am unaware of it ever being considered a serious threat. Okay, they simply did not have enough naval lift, to really threaten the west coast of the United States with invasion. They could threaten it in other ways, certainly shipping, okay, but not an actual invasion of the United States.
Right now, there's a perceived threat that China, in its unlimited friendship with Russia, will provide lethal force weapons to prolong the war in Ukraine. How do you think the United States should respond to that?
That is a tough one. That is a tough one. And I think that will be a step down the path of escalation that's not easily undone. All right. I really think that that is a step down that path. And I think we should all hope right now that the Chinese don't do that. Okay. Because I think that there's still some time. There's still some possibility that these tensions can be managed, perhaps even walked back. And I read your briefing book for today, which was excellent, by the way. But I realize I think I'm a bit more optimistic than the man that wrote it, who sees us already engaged in a Cold War. I think we might be, but I think the die is not cast just yet. The cake is not it's not baked just yet. There may still be a chance. If that happens, then I think that chance might be gone. And we should all hope that that doesn't happen. I mean, it's profoundly disappointing that a country that for so long has harped on the territorial sovereignty as a primary foundational goal of international relations did not condemn what Vladimir Putin did, right? It's very, very disheartening, but that is what has happened. And now we can only hope that they won't go further down that path, but they might.
My question is sort of related. I was thinking about rhyming history. I was thinking about our strength with allies. And I don't know if I'm being paranoid, probably, but it feels to me that there's a lot of international jostling right now with the rise of authoritarianism, that we have North Korea, Iran, maybe China, Russia, kind of forming and I'm reminded of Axis powers and allied powers. Are we forming almost like two sides of international authoritarianism versus Western democracy, liberal democracy? And are we headed towards something pretty catastrophic?
That is entirely within the realm of possibility. You know, and the android robots that teach history at the University of Wisconsin in 200 years might look back on this and say, yes, this is what happened. This is what happened. And that's why I feel like, especially this issue over the TTP, and especially our messaging to China is so important, because there should be clear space. There should be clear space to split China from Russia. That should not be difficult, given their history. Okay, that shouldn't be difficult. And I think had we played our cards differently in the teens, that would have been a no-brainer today. Now it's not. All right, it's still possible, I think. And I think the message to China needs to be that it's your behavior that's the problem, that we're willing to accept China's development, even on par with the United States. We should be willing to let the Chinese economy get larger than the United States. Because if we believe in our principles of free trade, of competition, of innovation, if we believe in the strength of democracy and that democratic societies can lead to better results and better decision-making, then we shouldn't have anything to fear from that. And we should also acknowledge that China has its own very serious internal struggles. Very, very serious. Okay, everything from demographic decline to pollution. Okay, I mean, they just have a wave of issues. All right. But yeah, I think that is a possibility. And right now, the decisions that we take could make that either more likely or less likely.
I'm scared.
Remember, China is not an existential threat to the United States. I sincerely believe that. Yeah.
The United States and the US, to say the least, have an image problem with most of the world. You know, for most of the world, the biggest threat to world peace is not China, it's not Russia, it's not Islamic terrorism, but it's actually the West. It's actually the US. Just to say, not long ago, for example, what's happened when there were demonstrations in Europe, in Germany, and the Czech Republic, because they were demonstrating because they want Russian gas, and the demonstrations were getting bigger and bigger and bigger until this Nord Stream pipeline, Biden blew them up. Kind of like said, there, you don't have anything else to demonstrate for. the United States is not seen by the world as a world policeman is something that decades was created. It's more like a mud boss that if you don't play with us. I went to China, one of my children is adopted from China. I was surprised, I was in Wenshan in southern China. The number of people you were talking about, the regional countries, thousands of Filipinos, Koreans living there. It's kind of like, people from Latin America or other countries come to the United States when they go there, and actually they make money. And actually, they don't want to have an alliance with the United States. They just want to just do business with China, the peoples. The U.S. government just deal at government level. But most of the world doesn't trust the United States. For example, Latin America is replacing the United States as a main partner. Now it's China, the biggest countries in Latin America, for example, and also the Chinese have a lot of projects they do in Africa, But now you were saying, for example, this.
Question.
Oh no, it's a comment. Sorry. No, you were. I don't know if you heard not long ago the Biden's ambassador in China. It was just like, we're gonna teach China how to behave. He said like a couple of weeks ago. It's almost saber-rattling.
Yeah, I think you're right that the United States does have an image problem, especially in certain regions, all right, especially in the global south. But I would direct you to the Pew Global Attitude Surveys, which are published every year, which has shown actually the United States image in the world improving drastically as the Chinese image in the world has dropped considerably. But you're right, there are many countries that don't want to be forced to choose between making money trading with China and getting their security from the United States. And I think that the United States harms its own position in the world when we try to force that choice, when we try to weaponize the economic advantage that we have in places like Korea or Japan, and the security relationships we have with those countries, try to weaponize that and getting them to break their very, very real economic relations with China. I don't think we should be doing that. I think when the United States does that, we do undermine our image in the world and we undermine a key source of our strength.
I had another question from someone online, and they wanted to know, what are your thoughts on Congressman Mike Gallagher and his leading of his committee on China? And go.
Full disclosure, I have an invitation out to Mike Gallagher to come address my class at the end of May and end of April, beginning of May, and I really hope he's going to come. All right, and one of the things as a historian that I try to instill in my students is real empathy for policymakers. Okay, because the stakes involved here are very, very high. They're very high. And there's no playbook, okay? There's no maxim that can guide you into doing it that will lead to the perfect outcome. So I have a lot of empathy for Mike Gallagher and the other people in Congress who actually have to make decisions now that will have consequences far beyond what they can see, all right? And I follow Mike Gallagher quite closely, all right? I don't know if he likes to talk about it, but Mike Gallagher has a PhD from Georgetown. He is a very, very smart man. He knows his history. Okay, and I think that also makes me kind of like him a little bit. All right, I think he thinks very hard about these things, and I think he deserves credit for really elevating these issues. All right. Now, at the same time, I watched all 2 hours and 52 minutes of the Select Committee on China last week, and while there was some good things in it, what my mind kept coming back to is, where is the off-ramp? Where is the off-ramp? Where is the end state? What are we hoping this relationship is going to look like in 50 or 60 or 70 years' time? All right, now this was just the first hearing. All right, and they're highlighting behaviors that are a real problem, but I came away from that hearing thinking that the off-ramp was the complete surrender of the Chinese Communist Party to the United States, which I don't think is likely, okay? Which I don't think is likely. And it was in that context that one of the congressmen, and his name tag was obscure, so I couldn't see, but asked about the TTP, asked H.R. McMaster's, why aren't we joining the TTP? And McMaster said, it's my understanding that there is no appetite in this political body to do that. All right. I think that was the wrong response from McMaster's. I think he should have said, you tell me why we're not doing that, okay? Because I think there are things that we can do for sure, right? That will minimize Chinese anxieties, that will allow them to see that we're focused like a laser on their behavior, and this relationship can be different and it can be more productive, all right? Now, at the same time, there's no playbook for what's going on here. And we live in a democracy where the interplay of forces is so incredibly complex that I have a lot of empathy for people like Matt Gallagher and Krishnamurti. All right. And so when I offer them criticism, I criticize them from that place. And I hope that they will do the right thing. I don't know exactly what that right thing is, but I have some questions right now.
Or was your question answered? Did you still have a question? Sure. Okay. I just saw your hand up.
I also should say one more thing about Mike Gallagher. One thing I deeply appreciate Mike Gallagher is he is a big supporter of international education. All right. And he is a big supporter of making sure that we're raising the next generation of Chinese, Korean, and Japanese speakers at places like the University of Wisconsin. Not all congressmen are so far-sighted, okay? There will be greater demand for these kinds of people going forward, all right? And I really appreciate his support for those kinds of strategic investments.
I'd like to go back a little to Taiwan and your writing history, which I enjoyed. And you started this out pretty much with Japan's adoption of Monroe policy. And it seems like maybe China now is doing something similar. And you were suggesting, I think, that one of the things that led to Pearl Harbor was our refusal to see Japan's interest there. So what should we be thinking about China in the South China Sea? And they're feeling, I guess, that that's pretty close to them. And, should we be drawing a line there?
Yeah, that's another really good question. And the United States would be in a stronger position in this regard if we had ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. We would be on a much stronger basis to condemn what the Chinese are doing in that regard. And in a certain sense, it's done, right? They built them. There's no going back on that decision. So I think where we are right now is, we're continuing freedom of navigation cruises through that area, and we're inviting China to abide by their international obligations in that regard. And I think that's the right thing to do. And China is not the only country that has claims in that region. The Philippines, Vietnam, all of those places do as well. And I think we should continue to work with our allies to make sure that the Chinese do not end up consolidating their position there and excluding all the other countries in the region. But I think they should also have the equal right to those seas that everybody else has as well. All right. But that's a very, very complicated issue. And I think we should respect that this is an area very, very close to China. Okay. It's an area where they've had some historical influence. And we should try to square that circle the best we can.
I have another question from someone online, and you will be next in the room. This person was interested in what your opinion is on China offering a peace plan in the Ukraine. Do you think that's possible?
Oh, they offered a peace plan. They offered it last week. I wouldn't say it had a whole lot of substance to it. as far as the issues. I mean, there was no discussion of what would the peace plan be based on as far as who would get what, who would leave what, okay? It was a statement of very lofty principles, but did not have a lot of specifics. And when I read that, I was very confused that anybody would actually think that that was a peace plan, that it was so vague and did not offer really any solutions to what happens to Eastern Ukraine in any sort of peace plan, you know? So yeah, I would say I was rather underwhelmed by that. And it's kind of troubling when you see what to the rest of the world, or at least in my eyes, looks like such a great miscalculation. When you realize that to propose a plan like that, there's a tremendous gulf between what they're seeing and what at least the West and NATO is seeing in that regard.
My question was along the same lines as why not let China broker the peace deal? Why not let them try? So they put out these 12-step plan that doesn't amount to much. Let them work on the details with Russia, put pressure on Russia so we don't have to.
You know, I think if they can do it, I think we should absolutely let them do it. Okay, if they could come up with a peace plan that would satisfy the Ukrainians and satisfy the Russians, I think we should let them have that victory. Absolutely. I did not see anything in this peace plan, though, that actually pointed towards a way forward. All right, but if they have a way forward, all truth is God's truth. You know, I mean, if they can do it, we should let them have that victory, and we should not oppose any good peace plan just because it's Chinese. Because the truth is, they do have a lot of leverage with Putin. All right, and perhaps there is a route back to de-escalation here, right? Where some sort of understanding would be possible, where they modify some of their behaviors in return for being readmitted in their relationship with the United States for a brokering of a peace that would actually roll back what Vladimir Putin has done. I think there should be a path. But I heard a presentation this week saying that the Chinese leadership honestly doesn't see what they would get from the United States from doing that. They don't see U.S. relations, they don't see their relationship with the United States getting any better, even if they oppose what Putin is doing. And I think that's a very sad commentary on our policy. A very sad commentary on our policy. But if you watch the Select Committee on China hearing yesterday, which I'm sure the Chinese did, that is the impression you would come away with. But I think you're absolutely right. If they would come up with a good plan, it should be. We should support it. We should support it.
Are there any other questions in the room?
Well, thanks a lot.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed this tremendously.
Thank you everyone for coming down tonight. Again, the weather wasn't optimal, but you braved it and came out. Please join us next week when our topic will be economic warfare. And our speaker will be Pablo Terral from Beloit College. So thank you for coming, and I don't have to rush you out of the room for a change, so enjoy.
Not getting better.